Coming up on this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. Like Mario's Through the Hourglass, these are the transition between console generations. If you go in the direction of the arrow, so the Nintendo Cartridge Society go in the direction of the arrow with you. Welcome to Nintendo Cartridge Society. My name is Patrick Ellers, and I'm joined, as I am always joined by my co-host, Mark Mitchell. Mark, how's it going?
It's going great. If you go in the direction of the arrow, full stop.
Full stop.
Does that mean on Tuesday we're going to get the second part of that?
No, that's the entirety of the text that this man or woman or bokoblin or whatever speaks to you. Frustrating, yes. Hard to say what's going on there.
Yeah, it's like if you go in the direction of the arrow and then they died or something like that.
Maybe that's it. That they just died in your arms. Obviously we're referencing Days of Our Lives at the top of this episode here.
Yes.
Do you have much experience with soap operas or?
No, not really.
Yeah,
I don't have any family members or anything who watch them. There are a couple of old episodes of General Hospital that got not spoofed. What is the word? Riffed on Mystery Science Theater 3000.
Okay.
But these are ones from maybe
count.
the 60s. Yeah. So no, I don't really. How about you?
No, I don't have any kind of, and it feels like a genre of thing that I mean, we're just past the time that they make any sense, right?
Yeah, I think so.
But it's the kind of thing that I'm like, that would have been fun to ride that wave for a little bit.
Yeah, dude.
I have constant new content every day.
Right, and I think some of them still exist. Do you remember 20 years ago? This is a bad subject for us to be talking about
because
we don't know anything.
And we've done maybe no
just better.
Yeah,
right? Maybe just better to move on.
Mark, earlier today, I was listening to an old episode that has just come onto the free feed of Connor McCabe's "Call Me by Your Game," where we talked about Metroid Dread. And I was like, hey, what a great game. I should, I want to play it again. And I was like, oh, you know what? I bought that physically. So I was going through, I've got a little case for my game carts, and it wasn't in there.
Uh-oh.
And I was like, wait a minute, where's my copy of Metroid Dread? Mark, do you remember that I got the special edition of that thing with a steel book and the cards and an art book and all that kind of stuff? The cart was still in that steelbook case, all put away because it's this big giant box that you can't have out, or at least I don't have the space to just have it out. But so I had to go digging for it.
Oh, but it was in there.
It was in there.
Oh,
yes.
That's good.
But there was a moment, Mark, where I was like,
that would have been sad.
Where's my copy of
That
Metroid
would have been
Dread?
really, yeah, that would have been sad.
I mean, I would have just gotten a replacement, but
you would have been happy about it.
I would not have been happy about it. But I was happy to be reminded of all the fun stuff that was in that collector's edition, which I basically named all the pieces of already. But some of the packaging itself was really cool looking.
Yeah, I do remember that being a really nice set.
Okay, Mark, we're talking about transition years in this episode. But before we do, just want to shout out to the Patreon, patreon.com/Nintendo Cartridge Society, where you can go to support us. And if you are supporting us at the 8 or 16-bit levels, you get access to our once-a-month episodes of miniseries like NCS Arcade.
Yes, and in NCS Arcade, Patrick and I are playing games generally that we've never beaten before, but this month is a little bit different. For January, we're going to be talking about the original arcade versions of Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Donkey Kong 3.
We're doing 3 games in one.
And I think it's going to be a lot of fun to talk about. And so that'll be coming in just a few days now. But anyone can follow us for free on Patreon. And if you're following us at any level, you get access to our listener feedback episode. So after I think we started this with season 2. After we do an episode of NCS Arcade, we solicit emails, feedback about that game or that game series, and then we do an episode responding to that feedback. And those episodes, those listener email episodes, are available to anyone.
So anyone should be emailing us about Donkey Kong Jr., or Donkey Kong 3, or kind of just your impressions of Nintendo arcade games of the early 80s. because I think we're going to be all over the map on that. So email us, Nintendo Cartridge Society
at gmail.com
to be included in the show. You can also email us if you would like an invitation to join the Discord, where people are talking about what they think is going to happen this year. Mark, I'm as guilty of it as anybody else.
Ooh, I mean, but
we want to know.
We want to know.
Yeah.
It's nice to know that we're going to find out more in April.
Yes.
But until then, there's still so much to speculate about.
There's so much to speculate about, including, like, will we get a Direct in February? There's a Pokemon Day in February. What's going to happen at those things, Mark?
Yeah, it's always fun to be in the Discord, but now is an especially fun time to be talking about all the Switch 2 stuff in the air.
Mark, and then at this point, we need to do a debug from the previous episode, from the news episode. A little bit of a mea culpa here. You were like, I was like, Mark, you have to upgrade your relics in Shovel Knight. And you were like, I have to what? My what?
Yeah, I just have so much, I mean, not to brag, but I have a lot of gold in Shovel Knight right now, and I
don't
sound
like a brag.
I don't want to buy. I mean, I could buy the other armor sets.
Buy the armor sets.
It just doesn't seem worth it.
What do you mean worth it? You have the money.
I know. Anyways,
so
yes, we were talking about this, and you were like, "Oh, you should go back and upgrade your relics," and I didn't know what you were talking about, so I tried to do that,
right?
But could not.
So then I was like, I went back into Shovel Knight. I was thinking of Spectre Knight, the Spectre of Torment. In that campaign, you can in fact upgrade every single one of his relics. But so I was wrong in this instance, and Mark, I feel foolish.
It's okay. Everybody makes mistakes.
No, but I feel foolish.
We all forgive you.
Thank you. I appreciate that, but I'm not asking for your forgiveness. All right, Mark, let's get into the main topic here. Let's discuss transition years for Nintendo. And we do this because we find ourselves in a transition year right now.
Yeah, you're sitting in it.
You are, in fact, sitting in it. And, it is always foolhardy to look to Nintendo's past to predict Nintendo's future. Right?
Except when it's not.
Except when it's like the perfect way to tell what's going to happen.
But you never know which one it's going to be.
You never know.
Yeah.
So we are going to kind of go through a couple of the main transition years when Nintendo is moving from one piece of hardware to the next, and just kind of take a look at the games that were released on both the outgoing and incoming platforms at that time, and see what kind of conclusions we can draw, and also just sort of what vibes we remember from those times, to sort of just characterize how Nintendo does these things.
Yeah, because there are certain things we know about this year. We know that a Switch 2 is coming at some point. We know that we're getting Xenoblade Chronicles X,
sure.
And we know that we're getting Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. But otherwise...
And Pokemon Legends ZA.
Yeah, that's right. But otherwise, it's kind of a mystery. And so at this point, it's probably too early to be drawing too many conclusions, but we can still look back.
Right. Well, and, with every passing day, I think the appetite for just like baseless speculation is building back up.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we're not quite there yet. I think, once April 2nd hits, then it's a free-for-all.
Yeah, totally.
Right? But until then, I feel like we got to keep our feet a little bit on the ground, right? And we can pore over the ancient tomes, looking as far back as 1991 or whatever, and say, here's what Nintendo has done in the past.
Yes.
Does this have any bearing on the future? Hey, who knows? And frankly, who cares?
Certainly not us.
Certainly not us. We just want to talk about what happened.
Yep.
And actually, as long as we are, as long as I mentioned 1991 already, let's maybe just talk, because we're not going to do like a full rundown of the transition from NES to Super NES for a couple reasons. Kind of chief among them is that it's a little bit hard for us, or for me personally, to wrap my head around what games were being released in the US or North America versus in Japan at that time. And so like what the transition looked like there versus what the transition looked like here. And like largely, I think your and my takeaway on the transition over the lifetime of those consoles is that the Super NES was a lot of developers realizing things that they were attempting on the NES.
Yeah.
Right? So like Super Mario World is just like what Mario 3 was aspiring to be, but now they actually have the technical tools to do it. Ditto, like Metroid to Super Metroid, uh, Link to the Past is another, like, where it's just like these are the proper executions of what they were maybe tech limited by on the previous generation.
And I feel like you see that because in the like I feel like when Nintendo doesn't do backwards compatibility,
Yes,
it's when there is a hard tech transition. And in the early years, there's a lot of that, right? You're going from like the
right.
NES to the Super Nintendo, and Japan was going from the Famicom to the Super Famicom.
Yes,
And those were like hard tech transitions. And then to the Nintendo 64, another like hard tech transition. Then you go to the GameCube, which
another hard tech transition. Yeah,
right, but then you start getting to this point that we're actually doing, like on the handheld side,
yeah, totally.
they're good with backwards compatibility, and then doing pretty good until the Wii U to Switch era, which is again like a big like tech transition.
Right. So, the other thing that makes like the NES to Super NES transition sort of like wonky and weird is that they kept putting out new first party NES games for a long time after the Super NES came out, right? Like Zoda's Revenge is like 1994 or something. And mind you, that's like one of the last ones along with Wario's Woods. But like those transitions were so soft, I guess is my point, that it's hard to draw like conclusions really, whereas if you look at something like it's maybe a little bit less pronounced in the next one from Super NES and Nintendo 64, which we are going to break down like sort of like game by game, but like Nintendo 64 to GameCube, they just stopped making Nintendo 64 games, and now it's GameCube's turn.
Right. And I do, well, that's getting ahead of, I don't want to
Yes.
jump ahead too much, but yeah, I totally think you're right. And I do wonder if that is something from the NES to SNES transition that we will see on the Switch. It'll be,
Yes, that's a great
I'm
point.
very curious, especially now that Nintendo's strategy, like even their own, like first party release strategy involves so many partners,
Right.
that if we will see first party Nintendo releases for Switch for a while,
Right. Well, because
even when if their
yes.
like own internal studios are focused on Switch too.
Right, because like there's this whole thing of like you have more power, and like look, we're not talking about the this transition year. We're talking about previous transition years. But there's so much like there's a push and pull between the Switch 2 grants you more power and like a freer ability to develop on the same scale that you are on other platforms. But the Switch 1, there are over 100 million of those out in the world right now that you can sell Switch 1 games to.
Right.
So it's a real like balancing act. And so I sort of suspect we'll see both for a while from first and third parties. But it's got to be like incumbent on Nintendo to like make something that will sell Switch too.
Yeah, totally.
But that's not what we're talking about, Mark.
I think we
Yes.
may end up talking about it despite our best efforts.
I think you're
but
probably
you're right. It's not what we're talking
It's
about.
not what we're talking about. Let's move on to talking actively about the Super NES to the Nintendo 64 transition year of 1996. Now, Mark, I just want to cast you back into 1996 for a second, because Mark and I have memories of basically all of these transition years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although I was never at the forefront of like these transitions. We didn't get a Nintendo 64 until a few years
Right.
into its release.
I, of course, was there on the day it released at the Target, insisting that they open the other box because they opened a box that just had Pilot Wings, and I said, no, open the other box. I want to play Mario 64. So well, let's kind of just like run down the list of games that were coming out for the Super NES during the year of 1996, and like one like little side note here in the transition year is that like this was a later transition than Nintendo had originally wanted, right? Like the Nintendo 64 was like they were hoping to have it out in 1995, but they were like way off target for that, which is kind of why we get the Virtual Boy in 1995. Is that they like needed some sort of like hardware hit, some console for that space, and kind of pushed this thing out before it was, obviously ready for not a successful console launch.
Right.
But so we are very late in the Super NES's lifespan. And here, go ahead.
Well, you're totally right. We are late in the Super Nintendo's lifespan, but it is funny to think that it was only 5 years old.
Yes. Yeah, I know, it's
Like
kind of shocking
compared to today's
yes
generations. Maybe it just speaks to how much technology was changing and improving, during that period.
Yes.
That it's like, okay, when the Super Nintendo came out, it was pretty high tech, but only a few years later, 3D graphics are on the scene in a way that, like, I don't know that we experience that anymore.
Yeah, well, and especially when like the Super NES was like also kind of later to the market than they would have liked, because the Genesis was already there and doing like 16-bit graphics in a way that was like making the NES look bad at that point. So like all of these things, it's interesting that like they're either driven by what the competition is doing or by what the technology will allow.
I know we're not talking about this year, but do you think, because in 2024, that was kind of this early speculation was that this is the year for new Nintendo hardware, and then
by some,
by
non
Patricks, yeah, by non Patricks,
yes.
But then I can't even remember when it hit, but I feel like pretty early in the year, the rumors, or really what turned out to be news, started coming out that it's like, no, Nintendo's delaying it to next year. For software reasons, to like make sure that they have like the software ready.
Right. Which is also kind of crazy to think that they were like gearing up to release Tears of the Kingdom and Pikmin 4 and Mario Wonder.
Well, that was in 2023.
No, that's 2023.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. Then it all makes sense.
Yeah, they were gearing up to release like another Code Recollection.
You're right. For whatever reason, I still think we're in 2024.
I know. It's an easy mistake to make, but it makes me wonder, like, do you think that the switch to Switch 2 generation, when we look back on it, so now we're really speculating, will be like this SNES to Nintendo 64 type thing where it's like, ooh, they really wanted to get it out in 2024.
Yeah, great question.
But they had to delay it to 2025. But the Switch is in such a much better position than, the Super Nintendo was.
Right, yeah.
That I guess I don't know that it'll end up mattering.
I mean, I think that's possible, but like, let's just run down the first party games that were coming out on Super NES in 1996. Its final year before like the Nintendo 64 takes over. Super Mario RPG, an all-time classic Mario game and RPG, a Square Enix developed game.
And I'll note, if the Switch 2 did come out in 2024, then Super Mario RPG Remake would have been a 2023 game, and so it would have been. Actually, there's no parallel.
No, there's no parallel whatsoever, unless it's like Brothership is the parallel,
right?
Except that didn't come out. Okay.
This is all wrong. That part is all wrong.
Okay, that part is all wrong. Ken Griffey Jr.'s Winning Run, also published by Nintendo. Tetris Attack, Kirby Superstar, which is sort of hard to believe that is that late in the Super NES's life cycle. Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, and evidently Nintendo published a Pinocchio game.
What?
In 1996, on the Super NES, Nintendo published Pinocchio.
Oh, you're right. So in Japan, it was published by Capcom, but in North America and Europe, it was published by Nintendo.
Strange.
Very strange.
Other like big third-party or big-ish third-party games that were coming out on Super NES at this time: Madden, NHL, and NBA Live 1997. Those were all like still coming to that platform. I think that's kind of a common theme that we're going to see over and over again. That like when they were still doing like annualized sports releases, that they would still come out on these systems even in their final years.
Oh yeah, Madden 97. Oof, I played so much of that on the Super Nintendo.
Other games that I pulled out here is worth noting: Street Fighter Alpha 2, Mega Man X3, Final Fight 3. they made two different Final Fight sequels, Final Fight 2 and Final Fight 3, that only came out on Super NES and are like not very well remembered, but they exist. So that's what the final year, or the last year of the Super NES before the Nintendo 64 took over. What did Nintendo put out on Nintendo 64 in its first year? Mark, it's a surprisingly small number of games.
You have Super Mario 64,
Mm-hmm.
Pilot 64, and those were the two launch titles.
Yep.
And then
literally the only two launch titles that not just that Nintendo did, but that anyone released.
Then you have Wave Race 64,
Mm-hmm.
Killer Instinct Gold, Cruisin' USA, and that is the first party lineup in 1996.
Yeah, that's the entirety of the first party lineup. Other kind of notable third party games: Mortal Kombat Trilogy, Wayne Gretzky 3D Hockey, and Star Wars Shadows of the Empire. Something interesting to note here is that the third party games are all American, right?
Oh, yeah.
The two Midway games of Mortal Kombat and Wayne Gretzky 3D Hockey and Shadows of the Empire being a LucasArts game, that like there was not in the first year a lot of like Japanese third party support for the Nintendo 64.
Well, and I feel like this in a lot of ways would be the story of the Nintendo 64, which was
Yes.
just not very many games. Like when you think about notable third party Nintendo 64 games, there just aren't that many of them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Turok Dinosaur Hunter, of course, and Shadow Man.
Uh-huh.
All these very important 17 plus games. But yeah, no, I mean, like, you're right. Outside of Nintendo and, you know, Rare, which was like partially owned by Nintendo at that point, or owned by Nintendo, it's the particulars of that always kind of elude me. That yeah, just people weren't really developing for that platform kind of at all.
Yeah.
So what can we really take as like a lesson or trend or theme from the transition from the Nintendo 64 or the NES to the Super NES to the Nintendo 64?
Well, I feel like it's notable that you have entries in Kirby, and maybe this is on my mind because we were talking about it in the Discord today.
Yeah.
You had brought up kind of like, what do you think we could expect in a February Nintendo Switch focused direct?
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about franchises that haven't shown up recently, and that Nintendo generally has like an annual release for, but we didn't see anything in 2024 Zelda related. And
in 2024?
Uh-huh.
No,
no, we did, of course.
We did. We saw Echoes of Wisdom, yes.
But we didn't see anything Kirby related.
That's right.
In 2024.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, Kirby does seem like a pretty solid like harbinger of doom for a console, where it's like you're on your way out, Kirby. And as this, yes, right. And they're like a big Kirby game, the one that would end up being like important in people's memories, and like that's one of your like early,
yeah, totally,
like favorite games, right?
The other thing I think is interesting is like Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie's Kong Double Trouble, which was developed kind of by the B team at Rare, while everybody else had moved on to like Donkey Kong 64. And I feel like we saw that in 2024, where we were getting a lot of kind of like B team efforts for the Nintendo Switch, while presumably everybody else was focusing on what's coming next.
Right. And also like, you know, leaning on partners too, right? And even partners to like develop something that might be a little bit, I'm talking about Super Mario RPG in this case, where like they just, you know, they need to keep their powder dry, as it were, so that they can develop their big studios working on games for the new system. And then sort of on the other side of that, that Nintendo has this, you know, it had been Mario basically for every launch, but having this cycle where they launch a like genre and platform defining game along with the system, right? And that's Super Mario 64. They had that right out the gate, where they were like, this is what the new system is, this is what it's capable of, and this is what everyone is going to be chasing for the duration of this console's lifespan.
Right.
And then there's other stuff too. And kind of weird, like disposable sports adjacent stuff. Pilot Wings, Wave Race, and Cruisin' USA are all like some variation on sports.
Mm-hmm.
which is just that's odd to me.
Yeah, Pilotwings 64 feels like, hey, it worked for the Super Nintendo,
Sure.
so let's do that again. And then Wave Race 64 and Cruisin' USA just feel so specific to the times.
Right. Yeah, and look, we all like convertibles and jet skis.
Yep.
So, what are you going to do?
It's the 90s, baby.
It is the 90s, baby. And then, of course, Killer Instinct Gold is there because Rare needed to put something out. So, and also that's like kind of just a port of the arcade game anyway. So, not really a high effort release, I would venture to say. Mark, do you want to move on to the? Do you feel like that it's a successful transition?
Well, I think Super Mario 64
right
saves it, right? And it's not that Nintendo generally has like a ton of first party games releasing like day and date with the console,
right?
But there's something about it that feels particularly slim when your options are Super Mario 64, like you said,
right.
Generation defining game released on day one. The console and the game were basically like made in tandem to work together.
Yes.
And then Pilotwings 64, which is a pleasant enough diversion, I guess. But
sure,
you just
right.
don't. I wouldn't say that it has really persisted beyond being a launch title.
Right. Yeah, it is. It's weird to try and like what I do think that it does do, and where it is a good transition, even if like the Nintendo 64 ends up being less successful than Nintendo would have liked and less successful than like PlayStation or whatever. That like Mario 64 does set the tone and set like a bar that like basically no one clears over the course of the next 5 years.
And I think if you're not an early adopter, if you are holding on to your Super Nintendo, that you make out pretty well. Like Super Mario RPG, Kirby Superstar, Donkey Kong 3, Donkey Kong Country 3, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, like all solid, like
totally
good games.
Totally. Let's move on now to, again, just 5 years later when the Nintendo 64 transitions to the GameCube in 2001. And so this transition is also like, it feels like late days for the Nintendo 64, but also like looking down the list of games that came out, like, I don't know, sort of bangers or sort of like interesting games.
Yeah, but it all feels like late console
totally
stuff.
Let's run down the list and talk about why they feel like late console stuff. So Paper Mario comes out on the Nintendo 64. Interesting that we're seeing that's effectively a sequel to Super Mario RPG, right? So like that's where those games live, is in the final year, or like during a transition year away from that generation. Other games from Nintendo on the Nintendo 64 in 2001 include Pokemon Stadium 2, Dr. Mario 64, Mario Party 3, and Conker's Bad Fur Day. So I guess I don't know bangers. I was just
Paper Mario has persisted.
Right. Well, and like Mario Party 3, a pretty good Paper Mario game, or
Mario Party
game. I think that's another maybe thing that we should pay attention to, is the existence of Mario Party games in final years. But yeah, the rest of these, Dr. Mario 64, I can't believe that's a final year release. It's so weird.
But I do think that we're beginning to see a little bit of a pattern. Like, yeah, we have this Mario RPG at the end, but now you're looking back on Switch's 2024 and you're like, okay, yeah, actually maybe
there was a Mario RPG there. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe it was better than most. Like final years of a console.
Right. Well, yes, if they had launched Switch 2 last year.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
right?
Yes, of course.
Which is not the case. Other big third-party games that were coming out on Nintendo 64 this year include Mega Man 64, which is their port of Mega Man Legends to the Nintendo 64. Madden NFL 2012 and NFL Blitz Special Edition, and Tony
2002.
Hawk's. Oh, yeah, 2002, sorry. NFL Blitz Special Edition and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2. Again, kind of just like the annualized at this point sports releases still finding a home on a console even in its final year.
Yeah. I feel like nothing particularly of note.
No, but I mean, we're talking about third-party games. on Nintendo 64. Nothing of note, but like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, that's an important game, right?
It is an important game, yeah.
It just didn't feel like a particularly important Nintendo 64 release, I guess.
Yeah.
Way more important on PlayStation. So what came out, Mark, in the first year from the GameCube?
Well, of course, the GameCube didn't have a Mario platformer at launch.
Right.
Instead, it had Luigi's Mansion.
Yes.
That was kind of the marquee launch title.
Which is like it's a little strange, and is a game that is remembered more fondly and like loved kind of now, especially for like what it establishes about it establishes a new series, but like was seen as a little bit of like a if not a disappointment, like a little bit of confusion as a launch game.
But other games that came out in 2001 for the GameCube include Wave Race Blue Storm, Pikmin, and Super Smash Bros. Melee.
So I really like seeing Super Smash Bros. Melee here, which is like just Smash ends up being something that like Nintendo starts to like really hang their hat on, and they don't really get it out in the first year of consoles after this. But like you can tell that they want to get them out quick, right?
Well, like we talked about in the NES to Super NES transition, where the Super Nintendo felt like the platform where developers were finally able to like really fulfill their dreams of what they wanted to create for the NES, but it was just too technically limited. That's how Melee feels to me.
Absolutely.
Between the original Smash Brothers and Melee. Melee just feels like original Smash Brothers, but done how Sakurai actually wanted to do it the first time.
Right. And then it becomes like this totemic thing, right? It's funny that Wave Race Blue Storm is also here as like sort of echoing the launch year of the Nintendo 64 getting Wave Race 64. Only to not really matter, right? That
right.
Like you can perfect a Wave Race game, it's still not going to be something that people are excited about.
Yeah.
But sort of fascinating that in the GameCube's launch year, we get this like series-defining game in Smash Brothers Melee, and then the invention of two new franchises in Pikmin and Luigi's Mansion.
Yeah, two franchises that I would say took a while to get their feet under them.
Yeah.
Like not really until the Switch generation that they both came into their own.
Yeah, I totally agree. So then big third-party games that came out on GameCube, All-Star Baseball 2002, Crazy Taxi, Star Wars Rogue Leader, Rogue Squadron 2, SSX Tricky, Simpsons Road Rage, Universal Studios Theme Park Adventure. Mark, I put that one on there for you.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
But I mostly wanted to point out here that here's another Star Wars game.
Oh, yeah.
Just like we saw in Shadows of the Empire, that like there's something about get your Star Wars game out, and maybe that was just like the time, right? That this is when Star Wars games were coming out,
right?
But all very interesting stuff, and a lot of these, actually all of them are also American studios. Acclaim, oh no, Crazy Taxi is Sega, but and SSX Tricky, that's an American studio too. Yeah, so a lot of American studio support for GameCube in its first year.
Well, I also think it's a good reminder that the GameCube had pretty solid third-party support.
Totally.
Like kind of surprisingly solid coming out of the Nintendo 64 era.
Yeah, well some of that is like Dreamcast orphans, right? That like games that were both from Sega proper and that had been developed by other studios now just like needed another home now that the Dreamcast wasn't being supported 2 years after its release, and GameCube was a perfect like place for that.
And I do think some of it also was that because Nintendo in a lot of ways was, they were using discs for the first time, even though they were itty bitty discs, but they were using discs.
Yeah,
that I think it was the first time that third parties were like, oh, we can more easily support the GameCube in multi-platform releases, and so it would get Madden, kind of like the last Nintendo console that would regularly get the sports entries. It would get a lot of EA stuff. Like EA was a strong supporter of the GameCube. You'd get the Need for Speed games. It would get maybe it was, I don't know if it was EA at the time, or I think it was EA at the time that had the James Bond license, but like Nightfire, like
Sure, yeah.
it got all of these
James
third-party
Bond, Agent Under Fire.
it got all of these third-party games, and then when the Wii came around, they're like, we're not doing that anymore. But they tried. They tried during the GameCube era.
Yep. So we're not gonna. Oh, okay. So is this a successful transition year, or like do you have any other like impressions, or was it just kind of like we need to bail on the Nintendo 64 and get the GameCube out there?
I feel like if you own your Nintendo 64 and you're not getting the GameCube, you're doing okay.
You're doing okay.
You got Paper Mario. You got Mario Party 3.
Right.
I mean, you got some other stuff too, but I would say those are the
games you got.
Those are the two.
And you can play like a bad version of Tony Hawk too.
Right. That's the version I played.
Right.
For sure. I feel like if you're, GameCube first year, you only have a few months of 2021. True. But like, I feel like in hindsight, it's a better release lineup than it felt like at the time. Like, Luigi's Mansion, I think now people view more favorably. Pikmin, like we talked about, has really come into its own as a franchise. And it's not like it wasn't it's not like it was unsuccessful. I think all the Pikmin games have sold over 1 million copies in their original release, but it just wasn't what it is now.
Right.
And then Super Smash Bros. Melee, that's the banger of the year, for sure.
That's absolutely the banger of the year, for sure. Okay, so we're not discussing the Game Boy to GBA transition for kind of the same reason that we weren't doing the NES to Super NES. But do you have any other just like stray thoughts about it?
Well, I think it's for that reason, plus the added wrinkle, and Nintendo did it to themselves. It's Nintendo's fault we're excluding it, partly because they're like, this is a third pillar. This isn't replacing.
I'm saying the Game Boy to Game Boy Advance.
Which
no. would have been the same year.
Yeah,
we're just not doing that.
Got it.
But yes, we are also not going to discuss the GBA to the DS, even though that's like handheld to handheld. This we are not doing, and it's Nintendo's fault. Go ahead, Mark.
Oh yeah, you're right, because Nintendo positioned the Nintendo DS as a third pillar and not as a replacement for the Game Boy line, because they were really hedging their bets.
Right.
Like if the DS is unsuccessful, if we Virtual Boy it all over again, we can just kind of memory hole it and release a new Game Boy, and that'll continue to be our mainstream like handheld console.
Yes, and this was all happening in 2004, which is only 3 years after the Game Boy Advance was
GBA.
Released.
Oh,
such a short life.
Yeah.
Such a weird short life. All right, but let's stay on this like kind of console track that we're on right now with the transition from the GameCube to the Wii. And again, just to like cast back to like the general vibes of this era, to me, the GameCube was feeling like creaky and kind of old. And like that gaming had generally moved on to other more like mature platforms, and like the Xbox was out there, Wreck and Shop, and the PlayStation 2 had just like absolutely dominated this generation. So what happened next needed to be something radical.
Right.
And was. So games coming out in the final year of the GameCube's life from the first party: Chibi Robo, Plug Into Adventure, Odama, Baten Kaitos Origins, and Zelda Twilight Princess.
I've never played a Chibi Robo game.
I've never, honestly, outside of Twilight Princess, I've not played any of these games.
Yeah, because Odama is like that pinball-esque game.
It's like a pinball strategy game that you control with a microphone.
Right. You're like shouting orders at the little soldier people or something.
It's like a strange video game experiment. And then Baten Kaitos, those are Bandai Namco games, right?
Right.
That, Nintendo published on GameCube. So like these feel like slim pickings, right?
Right.
For notable third-party releases on the GameCube this year, I have the Mega Man X collection. Okay, kind of cool. Lego Star Wars 2, the original trilogy. I guess that was probably just being released everywhere. And then a bunch of like IP slop.
I can't believe that the Lego games are probably like 20 years old.
Yeah.
Wow.
Like the Lego Star Wars games? Yeah.
Well, yeah, but if this is Lego Star Wars 2, that means that a Lego Star Wars game.
Yes, had been out years previous.
Yeah. Wow.
So kind of an anemic showing from GameCube in its final year. And then honestly, not a ton of games coming out for the Wii in the first year, which, to be fair, is like a month, right?
Right.
We're just looking at the launch window of games. But boy, what a series of games. Excite Truck, whatever. And then Zelda Twilight Princess and Wii Sports.
Yeah, and really, I would say Wii Sports is the Mario of the Wii era.
Yes.
Where it's just like, here is the generation defining game.
Yep.
And it's here right at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And not to like shame Twilight Princess at all, because it's a really great game. But unlike you've talked about in the past with Breath of the Wild and how Breath of the Wild and the Switch were just like kismet.
Yes.
Like the promise of both were that you could play however you wanted, anywhere that you wanted to. Like Twilight Princess, I played it on Wii. I enjoyed it on Wii, but it felt like an awkward, it didn't feel like it was created for the Wii. It did feel
because it
like
was created for GameCube, right?
Right.
And then they're like, we better put
we have some motion controls here.
Right.
You can waggle. But yeah, so it didn't have the same impact on Wii that
it didn't, but like I would still sort of argue that like it kind of did, because when you are playing Wii Sports, you can do some of that by yourself, but like it's mostly you're playing with other people, and then at the end of the day, you want like a longer experience or like a solo experience. And like Twilight Princess, for like Zelda games at the time, it was so long, right? Like it's just like this big sprawling adventure that would just go on and on and on. And like for being a competent execution of a Zelda game, which is already like one of the best kinds of games there is, it's kind of a perfect companion to Wii Sports, even if they have like nothing to do with each other.
I see what you're saying.
That it just like fills out that those two games together, you're like, here's your casual party game that everyone can access, and here's your, for lack of a better word, like hardcore gamer game, and you can play them both on launch day of the Nintendo Wii.
And I do think that the introduction of Wii Sports in the Wii era has set a pattern for at least the last 3 Nintendo like home console launches, and we'll see what happens with the Switch 2. But it's like, hey, we're launching with a casual party game.
Right.
That is a type of launch title that we want to have with all of our consoles.
Yeah, and with obviously like hugely diminishing returns after after Wii Sports, right?
Right.
Like Wii Sports is like the outlier, and then the rest of, because we're talking like Wii Party and 1-2 Switch, right?
Oh, Nintendo Land.
Nintendo Land, sorry,
Switch.
that's
yeah.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Nintendo Land and 1-2 Switch, which like largely forgotten games,
right?
Or remembered as punchlines. Big Wii third-party titles that came out in its launch year include Madden NFL 07, Marvel Ultimate Alliance, Rayman Raving Rabbids, Red Steel, and Elebits. So again, a lot of American support, and here we're starting to see the Ubisoft support showing up in Nintendo console launch year in the form of Ultimate Alliance and Red Steel.
Or you mean Rayman Raving Rabbids?
What did I say?
You said Ultimate Alliance.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, Raving Rabbids and Red Steel. Red Steel. Small sidebar on Red Steel for a second.
Sure, let's do it.
I feel like a perfect example of what we see a few times in the future, where it's like, okay, we're launching this game as a console exclusive. It's gonna be on one console, and that is, like Nintendo console. Red Steel sells well, and they're like, okay, for the second one, we're going multi-platform, and it's gonna be bigger, but it's not. There's something about being that console exclusive. Like, I feel like we saw that with Octopath Traveler.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, now we're gonna do Octopath Traveler 2. It's on every platform. Like it's gonna be Epic Mickey. Another example, Epic Mickey 2.
Right.
We're gonna do it everywhere.
Sorry, did you say Zombie U?
No, I didn't say
that's
Zombie
another
U.
one. Yeah.
But and then it's just like there's something about being a console exclusive that I think really helps these games.
Is its own currency.
Yeah. And then trying to like capitalize that and be like, oh, we'll obviously just do better. if we release it everywhere, it doesn't always turn out that way.
Well, and I think a lot of that is also exclusives early in a generation.
Totally.
Right? Like, can't count the number of well, I think Octopath is a great example. That like it being a Switch exclusive when it launched, in the second year of the Switch, that people were excited about their machine but needed more stuff to play on it because there just weren't that many games at the time. So people bought it just being like, yeah, sure, I love playing my Switch. I'll play this game on it.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's something to being like, ooh, this is like precious to me. Like, oh, there's not that many RPGs that are exclusive to the Switch.
Right.
But if you own a PlayStation 4, you're not like, oh, Octopath Traveler 2 came out. I've never played a game like Octopath Traveler 2 on the PlayStation.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Should we move on to the one like handheld transition year that we want to talk about?
Oh,
or do we want to talk about if this is successful?
I think, yeah, before we do that, let's just talk about, so if you're a GameCube fan, I'm going to say Twilight Princess.
And then nothing.
Yeah, nothing else really. And if you're Wii, I think this is a really strong start for the Wii.
I think it's a really strong start. First party and third party. Like, the third party support wouldn't be there by the end, or at least in any way that's like meaningful or good. But at the beginning, there's some cool stuff showing up.
Yeah, and funny that Ultimate Alliance and Rabbids would both show up again.
Yeah,
as Nintendo like exclusive stuff in the Switch generation.
Yeah, weird stuff. Okay, now moving on to the DS to the 3DS. I was sort of shocked by the number of games out on both platforms in this transition year of 2011.
It does help for the 3DS that it launched early in 2011
yes.
versus some of these other ones. But yeah, it is a remarkable lineup, and I think that the 3DS's lineup speaks to the strength of the DS and everybody being like, oh, I want to be on board the 3DS train.
Yes, that is absolutely true. But also, like, Nintendo was ready. We'll get to what exactly games they put out on 3DS, but they were ready to launch that thing with some killer games. On the DS in the first party lineup, it is sort of a story that we've told a couple times before, in that Dragon Quest 4 Reels of Revelation and Dragon Quest Monsters 2, or Dragon Quest Monsters Joker 2, were both published by Nintendo, obviously developed by Square Enix. And so that's another where they're like relying on their partnership with
Realms of Revelation.
Realms of Revelation, thank you. That's Dragon Quest 4 Realms of Revelation. So they're relying on their partnership with Square Enix to fill out the last years of a console life. Professor Layton and the Last Scepter, which was also published by Nintendo, came out 2011. Kirby Mass Attack, Fossil Fighters Champion, those are all like Nintendo whatevers. But Pokemon Black and White. So the year that they put out a new handheld, Pokemon was like, we're not ready for that. We're going to stay on the old hardware.
Yeah, because Pokemon, until the Switch generation, played the Dragon Quest game in Japan, where Dragon Quest for the longest time was created for the system that had the biggest install base.
Right.
And so it was like, okay, this is, even if that meant it came in late in the system's life, Pokemon used to do the same thing. They were not.
Well, they sort of still did with Switch, right? Because Let's Go Eevee and Pikachu doesn't come out till 2018.
That's true, but I think I remember it being a big deal in 2017 when there was, I think it was the June Nintendo Direct, there was a representative from the Pokemon company
yes.
talking about how they're developing new stuff for Nintendo Switch, because I think the expectation from everybody was that the new generation of Pokemon is not going to be on Switch yet because the Switch install base isn't large enough.
Right.
But that didn't end up being the case. So
right.
I think
the next generation was in fact on Switch.
Yes, I think that but you're right that Black and White was their old way of doing things, which was, yeah, we're just going to sit back. We're not on the new hardware.
Yeah.
We're going to be on the old hardware that we know has a huge install base.
And it's just crazy that like that is the like happening during that year. It's just like, oh boy. Big third-party games that came to the regular old DS include Ghost Trick Phantom Detective, Kingdom Hearts Recoded, a bunch of Lego games, and a bunch of just licensed slop, as you are wont to see on the DS.
And none of these, I feel like Ghost Trick Phantom Detective is a cult favorite,
Mm-hmm.
but bombed hard when it
Yeah,
released
totally.
on the DS. Like, didn't make any sort of impact at all.
And then who's playing Kingdom Hearts Recoded except for like the Kingdom Hearts heads, right?
I'm not even sure which one this
I
is.
don't know either. And I'm never gonna pretend to know. Should we start going through the first party 3DS lineup? Because this I do think is one of the more impressive launch year lineups. And like you said, came out early in the year, but like it's an impressive bit of software here.
Yeah, totally.
So we get Nintendogs and Cats, 3 different editions of that. Pilot Wings Resort, Steel Diver. Okay, that's just clearing the deck for everything else. Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D, Star Fox 64 3D, Tetris Axis, Pokemon Rumble Blast, Super Mario 3D Land, and Mario Kart 7.
It's kind of wild that the 3DS struggled just looking at the
I
software
know.
lineup.
I know. Because, like, Star Fox 64, or not Star Fox, Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D is, like, kind of regarded as, like, one of the great games on the system, right?
Right. And like the best way to play Ocarina of Time.
Right.
And unless you had that like Wind Waker pre-order bonus disc, then you didn't have a way to play it on the GameCube.
Yeah, that's right. And therefore, well, I guess you could play it on your Wii at this point
You're right.
because it would have been on the virtual
Yes,
console.
on the virtual console.
Um, but I do think the thing that is missing from here is the platform defining, genre defining game, right? Like these are all really solid things, but there's nothing here that like demands you buy the 3DS when the DS still exists, right?
Right.
There's good stuff, but like 2 of the biggest titles that I was excited to announce are remakes of Nintendo 64 games.
Right.
So I don't know. The other big third-party 3DS games include Lego Star Wars again. This is the Clone Wars and Lego Harry Potter years 5 through 7. Super Street Fighter 4 3D edition. Resident Evil: The Mercenaries 3D. Frogger 3D. Skylander: Spyro's Adventure. Cave Story 3D, and Sonic Generations. So there's Sega showing up. There's Capcom showing up in kind of a big way. And these Star Wars and Harry Potter, the Lego games.
One thing that's interesting to me about the first party 3DS stuff, you're talking about like the big genre defining game.
Yeah.
I do think that one speaks to the wonkiness of 3D as being the big selling point. I would say that 3D Land,
Super Mario 3D Land,
probably comes the closest to what they were attempting to do with that. But I remember, and I didn't own a 3DS at this point, so it is possible that I'm misremembering, but I kind of remember the reception to 3D Land being muted. Not that it was a bad game. I think it reviewed well. And my memory is that a lot of the discussion was like, oh, it gets good once the bonus stuff opens up at the end.
Which is true of it.
But I feel like 3D Land has, like, I don't feel like people talk about 3D Land.
Right. It has like a little bit of a stain on it. And like in a way where like I'm not surprised that Nintendo hasn't like remastered it for Switch or something. And like part of that is maybe the reliance on the 3D slider to like actually make sense of what you're seeing on the screen. Like there would be times when you'd go into puzzles and you would need to have the 3D turned all the way up so you could actually perceive what was happening like in the little puzzle room. Otherwise it would all look kind of flat. And they would like do these optical tricks so that like you had to kind of like rotate around and like use that depth perception that like if you didn't have that would maybe like break the game. I don't know. It was, you're right, leaning into the 3D-ness of it, but I think that wasn't a gimmick that like spoke to an audience, right?
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think that a lot of what was great about 3D Land was perfected in 3D World.
Absolutely.
Yes. And so it's just kind of another reason, yeah, It's just weird to have a major Mario title like Super Mario 3D Land that nobody really talks about.
Right.
People are kind of indifferent about.
Although I would love to see it come to Switch. I would be excited about that. Okay, so what do you think? Do you think this is a successful transition? It's tough, I think, to transition out of the DS because it was a behemoth.
But looking at it from Nintendo's perspective, they must have been shocked when the 3DS got off to a rocky start.
Right.
Because it is a pretty stacked lineup of first party releases. I would say on the DS, as far as like the first party stuff goes, it's really for a very specific audience. You got Pokemon. That's a big deal.
Right.
But otherwise, I would say
you got a remake of a Dragon Quest game. You've got a
but that's like such a tiny.
That's true. It's
true. Like if you're a Dragon Quest fan, but congratulations to the 150,000 of you that lived in the United States at that time.
Right. But I mean, like I don't know. It's just like so interesting that like the audience for the DS had grown into such a specific thing that like transferring out of that was always going to represent like a loss in audience, right?
For sure. And I mean, I maybe that's a parallel to draw to the dangers of
I think so.
The Switch 2 era. But to me it just feels like go ahead.
I was just have you heard like rumors or like seen rumors that one of the games like pegged for the release year of the Switch 2 is a remake of Ocarina of Time?
I've heard this floated.
This feels like echoes of the DS to 3DS, which had an Ocarina of Time remake as part of it. Like that would be a history truly repeating itself.
It really would.
To the
maybe
point,
a poor portent.
Maybe a poor portent.
But I don't believe it. I don't believe that they're remaking Ocarina of Time. But I do. What I wanted to say is that I feel like maybe like. Do you think that we can look at this and say, well, part of the reason why the first party DS stuff was so, I would say, kind of anemic is that they are now needing to transition more effort into the Wii U. Because at this point, they still had, developers split between the handheld stuff. And, because the 3DS lineup is really good, but it's 2 remakes, like a Pokemon spin-off, Nintendogs, like it's really like Super Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7 are like the major new entries that aren't a remake of a previous game that were handled by, because I think both Zelda Ocarina of Time and Star Fox 64 were both done by Grezzo. I don't know who did Star Fox 64, but I don't think it was done internally at Nintendo.
Right, and Ocarina of Time was definitely Grezzo. But yeah, and like the different versions of Nintendogs, that's really just like upscaling the DS game. So this feels like not that successful of a transition, despite the fact that like I can read through the list of games and it's like, oh wow, cool, a lot of things on offer there, just like nothing crucial, nothing demanding that you get this thing.
Yeah.
Should we move on, Mark?
Yes, let's do it. To the Wii U.
Yes, just 1 year after the transition from the DS to the 3DS in 2012. First-party games still coming out on the Wii include Rhythm Heaven Fever, Poke Park 2, Mario Party 9, Xenoblade Chronicles, some new play control games including Mario Power Tennis and Pikmin 2, and Kirby's Dream Collection, which was like a anniversary collection of some Kirby games.
And I might be misremembering, but hadn't Xenoblade Chronicles been released in Japan before 2012, and it was brought over kind of as like an end of life thing?
As like a please, dear God, remember, please don't think that we've forgotten you entirely.
So I think that the game was originally released in 2010 in Japan.
Oh, okay.
And didn't make it to North America until 2012, because I think it was part of the Project Rainfall project.
Right, yes.
That like the fans were like, there's these unreleased games that released in Japan and never made it to North America. like Pandora's Tower, like The Last Story,
right.
that
And
Nintendo just of
yes.
America just showed no interest in bringing over.
And that were all like these sort of more mature like RPG like experiences that weren't really fitting with the brand of the Wii
Uh-huh.
uh, worldwide. But like you can't stop Japanese developers from making whatever they're going to make, and so they were big in Japan. But like, yeah, with the exception of Xenoblade, didn't come over here until much later.
And then the other thing to remember is that by 2012, the Wii was basically a dead platform.
Yeah,
Because Nintendo was not they weren't putting big games out on it, and I think that shows with everything that releases in 2012.
yeah. I mean, it really is funny that Xenoblade would be a 2-year-old game that they're porting over from Japan. The new Play Control games are just new control methods for GameCube games. Kirby's Dream Collection is just a collection of like Super NES games and stuff like that. So it's really like Rhythm Heaven Fever and Mario Party 9, like
Uh-huh.
both party games. Like Nintendo wholly slouching into the like, I guess we were only ever good at being a party machine.
And maybe this, if more than anything, speaks to the difficult transition from SD development to
Yes.
HD development, which all the many other developers, they went through that pain in the PS2 to PS3, Xbox 360 transition, but Nintendo had delayed that pain and yet wasn't able to.
Hadn't really learned anything from it,
Yeah.
it seems. Big third-party games coming to the Wii in its final year: Skylanders, Giants, Just Dance Greatest Hits, and Epic Mickey 2: The Power of Two. What a flop that game was, right?
Yeah, totally.
Uh,
Totally.
all right, so here is the transition to the Wii U. Kind of a perplexing set of games here, don't you think?
Got new Super Mario Brothers U,
Mm-hmm.
Ninja Gaiden 3, Razor's Edge.
Which was published by Nintendo for some reason, Nintendo Land, and Sing Party. It's such a first of all, 4 games.
Sorry. Is it Ninja Gaiden or Ninja Gaiden?
I mean,
Gaiden, right?
well, it would be Gaiden.
Okay.
Like to actually say it right, like the way the word is supposed to be
Sure.
pronounced.
I
Gaiden.
believe you.
Um,
But yeah, a perplexing list.
yes,
In a way, like Nintendo Land makes sense, right? They're like, okay, with the Wii, we had these motion controls, so we have Wii Sports.
yes,
What are we gonna do to show off the new tablet controller? Nintendo Land. So like the idea is there, but the execution just didn't stick.
yeah. Well, and then like on top of that, we get New Super Mario Brothers U, which I think is like largely believed to be like the best one of the new Super Mario series, but is still kind of like, I don't know, like that feels like a year two filling in the gaps kind of game.
Well, which is exactly because also in 2012 on the 3DS, you did get new Super Mario Brothers 2.
Oh
So
yeah.
that was 2 new
Oh
Super Mario
boy.
Brother games that were
In the
coming out
same
in the
year.
same year.
Brutal. Yeah, so and that would be the second year too. Other games coming to the Wii U third party games: Zombie U, previously mentioned, and then stop me if you've heard this before. Skylanders, Giants, and Epic Mickey 2, games that were also out on the Wii. And of course, 007 Legends, which was like another like James Bond where you could like play as different James Bonds from, or maybe they were all Daniel Craig and they were like stories from different James Bond games.
Maybe, yeah.
So close to being like the thing that I actually want of a James Bond game. But yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any way to spin this as a successful transition.
Yeah, definitely not. Like if you're a Wii player, there's not much there for you. If you're a Wii U player, I don't like in as a first thing, Nintendo Land is not the worst like experience you could have because it does use the tablet, which quickly
Yes.
fades away. Like the tablet is integral to playing Nintendo Land.
It's just missing the like deep single player experience. Even the like hardcore game is a new Super Mario Brothers game.
Yeah. Like going back to what we were saying previously, there is no generation defining game in here in the mix here.
Yeah, not even close. It's also all of these games are like or a lot of these games are multiplayer, sort of relying on the fact that you still have Wii remotes to like keep to keep that sort of multiplayer component, because people didn't have like two game pads,
Right.
right? Like this new Super Mario Brothers U was available at launch because they knew everyone had a bunch of Wii remotes sitting around their house.
And probably because it was easy to develop in HD. It's a
Probably,
2D side
yes.
scroller, you know.
So kind of a bummer of a transition year, but then again, the Wii U was a little bit of a
Yeah,
bummer.
it kind of sets the tone
Yeah.
for that entire generation.
Which leads us to our sort of final transition year that we have data for, because we don't have any data about this year yet. And that is the transition from both the Wii U and 3DS to the Switch in 2017. First party games coming out on the Wii U, Mark, how many were there?
One,
and it was Breath of the Wild. Which, hey, great for Wii U owners. It's one of the greatest games of all time. You were playing it on Switch.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
The first party support for the 3DS surprisingly surprisingly stacked.
It's robust.
It's robust.
There are the number of games is impressive.
The number of games is impressive, and some of them are. There's at least one legit banger in here. So we got Dragon Quest VIII: Journey of the Cursed King, Poochie and Yoshi's Woolly World. So we're both like remakes or ports there. Mario Sports Superstars, Fire Emblem Echoes: Shadows of Valentia, a like ground up remake of Fire Emblem 2, a really good game, and I think one that gets sort of like lost to the dustbin of post Switch 3DS history. But a cool game. Ever Oasis, Hey Pikmin, which is like a forgettable Pikmin entry. Miitopia, which would later get remade on Switch. Monster Hunter Stories, which would also be released later on Switch. Metroid Samus Returns, probably the biggest release of the year, and one that I'm actually classifying as like a solid banger, even though technically a remake.
Yeah. Yep.
Continuing down the list, Yokai Watch 2, whatever its subtitle was, Mario and Luigi Bowser's Inside Story, which is not. Wait, was this the one that sold like no copies?
Yeah, was this the flop? I think so.
And then Fire Emblem Warriors, Mario Party: The Top 100, and Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon.
So there was a lot to play.
Yes.
And I would say like the breadth of the genres is impressive.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it does feel a lot like the Switch's 2024, doesn't it? Like a lot of remakes, and then like some kind of interesting like new stuff, but yeah, and then there's very little third-party support for either platform in 2017, because the Switch comes out of the gate with a ton of great games.
Yeah. Really, looking at it now, in a lot of ways, a repeat of what they attempted to do with the 3DS, but it's stuck with the Switch.
Yes, absolutely. Breath of the Wild, 1-2 Switch, Snipper Clips, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, ARMS, Splatoon 2, Pokken Tournament DX, Fire Emblem Warriors, Super Mario Odyssey, and Xenoblade Chronicles 2. There's at least 2, possibly 3 genre or like platform defining, genre defining games in that list. And then there's a ton of third party support as well.
Yeah, including some really interesting ones like Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle, Sonic Forces, and Sonic Mania. Doom 2016 gets ported, LA Noire, Shovel Knight, Axiom Verge, Resident Evil Revelations Collection, Ultra Street Fighter 2, The Final Challengers, Puyo Puyo Tetris, Binding of Isaac Afterbirth Plus, Cave Story. So you're getting some of those indie games.
And some of that Capcom support as well, in addition to Ubisoft in the form of Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle. It's like kind of the Avengers of people who supported Nintendo in their first year of various other consoles showing up for the Switch.
And it really pays off for them this time.
Totally. So, Mark, is this a successful transition year?
Yes, I would say so.
It's like the most successful, like clearly so, transition year that both like sets the tone for what they want to do with the new stuff going forward, and is just like a perfect forget about what you had. Now you have this.
Yep.
All right, that's it. We don't have another transition year to discuss. because we're in one. Do you believe in transition years? You better start because you're in one. What's that character's name?
Barboza?
No, who's talking to Will Turner. Will Turner.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. That's what I was trying to remember because I think he calls him Will. I think he, right? Do you believe in ghost stories, Will Turner?
Could be.
It could be.
I can't remember.
And I refuse to remember. Mark, any other thoughts about transition years before we close out here?
No, I think we covered it all really well. It will be interesting in a few years to look back on the Switch 2.
Yes.
And 2025 and to see kind of where it falls in being successful or not successful.
Yep. All right, Mark, let's close this out. All right, that is going to do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society. If you have any thoughts about transition year games or sort of initiatives or whatever that we failed to mention, email us, nintendocartridgesociety@gmail.com, or use that email to join the Discord and discuss it with us in the Discord. That's going to do it for this episode of Nintendo Cartridge Society.
I found it.
What did you find?
On Goodreads.
What's that?
You best start believing in ghost stories, Miss Turner. That can't be right. Miss Turner?
Is he talking to Elizabeth?
I think
have they been married at this point?
Yeah, so is he talking to...
He's talking to Keira Knightley.
He's talking to Keira Knightley.
Oh, okay. Well, and is this what he's saying as he's like coming back at the end of the second movie when like we thought he was dead?
No, it's in the first movie.
What the heck?
But multiple places.
It says Miss Turner?
Yeah, including the Pirates of the Caribbean subreddit.
Huh. Okay. Well, I don't know what to believe now. Thank you for looking this up, by the way.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Thank you to our 60-bit patrons, Connor McCabe, Therese Millette, Kyle Seaborn. We appreciate you. We appreciate all of our patrons and everyone listening to us now. It is only by your interest that we do this at all. Join the Discord if you haven't already. Anthony DeLuca made our logo. Our theme music is provided by 8-Bit Betty. You can get more of his music by going to 8bitbetty.com or by listening right now. For my co-host, Mark Mitchell, this is Patrick Ellers saying you better start believing in ghost stories. Thanks for listening.